In April of 1901, a civil engineer named Edward Fales submitted a drilling report to the Mississippi River Commission's St. Louis District Office that was never forwarded to Washington. The report covered bore samples taken at 6 locations across the American Bottom floodplain near the village of Cahokia, Illinois, as part of a drainage improvement survey for the expanded rail corridor running east out of St. Louis. 5 of the 6 samples were entirely routine: soft clay, river loam, stratified sand at the expected depths. The 6th was not. Fales noted, in the summary column for bore point C6, located at the base of the north face of Monk's Mound, the largest earthwork in North America, that the bore had penetrated a layer of compacted clay at 23 feet and encountered below it a void of structural character, appearing to be defined by worked timber and dressed stone, dry and of undetermined depth. He flagged the sample for follow-up and filed the report with the district office on the 14th of April. Within 3 weeks, a party from the Bureau of American Ethnology arrived at the site. Within 6 weeks, the access point had been sealed with compacted fill. Within 8 months, Edward Fales had disappeared from every directory, professional registry, and official record in which he had previously appeared. The St. Louis City Directory, the Missouri Engineering Licensing Rolls, the Mississippi River Commission's personnel files. He does not resurface in any record through 1910. There is no death record, no obituary, no forwarding address. He found something in the Great Mound, and then he was gone. I came to Fales through a door I was not expecting. I had been working through the Mississippi River Commission's drainage survey files for the American Bottom between 1895 and 1910, looking for something entirely different. Early dredging operations near the Grand Plaza at Cahokia that might have disturbed the site before it was formally protected. The Commission's St. Louis District Archive is held at the National Archives Regional Facility in Kansas City, and it is not well indexed. You spend a long time looking at routine correspondence before you find anything that changes your direction. What I found, in a folder of unremarkable administrative letters from the spring of 1901, was a note from a surveyor named G. H. Whitmore to the district engineer, dated May 9th, referencing an unnamed colleague who had made a significant discovery below the Great Mound at Cahokia, and who had been asked by the Smithsonian Party to say nothing further of it. Whitmore's letter is not agitated. It is the letter of a man who has absorbed something and decided very calmly that he would prefer not to be nearby. He was requesting a transfer to the Commission's Memphis district. He did not explain further. And in the margin of his letter, in pencil, in a hand different from the letter itself, someone had annotated 4 words: Fales, refer to file C6 report. Closed. By the time we reach the end of this, you will understand what Fales likely found, why it was sealed in 1901, and why the physical evidence for what lies beneath Monk's Mound has been sitting in archives that are technically open to the public for more than 60 years without anyone connecting the pieces. Because connecting the pieces requires working across 4 separate archives in 3 different states, and knowing, before you begin, that you are looking for the same thing in all of them. I want to be clear about what I can show you and what I can only indicate the shape of. I cannot tell you what Edward Fales saw when the bore came up from 23 feet. What I can show you is a chain of documented evidence spanning 8 decades of geological and geophysical work, all pointing in the same direction. Something structural lies beneath the primary mound at Cahokia. The people who first encountered it made a deliberate decision to seal it, and the record was arranged so that there would be no obvious reason to ask why. Monk's Mound is the most understated landmark on this continent. At its full height, 100 feet, with a base covering 14 acres, constructed from approximately 22 million cubic feet of earth, moved entirely by human labor. It is larger by volume than the Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan. It was the civic and ceremonial heart of a city that, at its population peak around 1050 C, held somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people, which made it larger than London at the same moment in time. The city had an astronomical woodhenge, a circle of massive cedar posts used to mark solstices and equinoxes. It had a palisaded inner precinct surrounding the central plaza. It had a planned urban layout extending across more than 5 square miles, with residential districts, specialized workshop areas, and subsidiary mound complexes arranged in relation to the central axis with a precision that is not accidental. The society that built it traded copper from the upper Great Lakes, shell from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica from the southern Appalachians. This was not a village that grew into a mound. It was a city that was planned as one, sustained for more than a century at urban scale, and then, for reasons the archaeological record has never satisfactorily explained, abandoned. The people who built Cahokia are the ancestors of the nations the European settlers eventually encountered. The Osage, the Quapaw, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw. They did not vanish. They contracted. And the mound that was the center of their world remained, mostly unmolested, until the railroads arrived. Consider what Monk's Mound is in engineering terms. It was not built in a single effort. Geotechnical analysis from the 1960s onward established that the mound was constructed in at least 14 distinct stages over several centuries, each stage adding a new layer of fill placed on top of the previous one. Each layer different in composition, different clay textures, different soil types. Evidence that specific materials were selected and hauled from specific sources for specific stages, implying a construction program centrally planned and maintained across generations of builders. Some of those fill materials came from more than 10 miles away. The degree of organizational complexity required to sustain a coordinated earth-moving project of that scale across 2 centuries is not the work of an unsophisticated society. It is the work of a society with administrative structures, resource management, and institutional memory durable enough to outlast the people who initiated the original design. Inside those stages are voids. Some are the shadows of wooden buildings that stood on earlier construction levels before the next fill layer buried them. Post-molds, the collapsed outlines of structures that rotted out centuries ago and left only their negative spaces behind. Some appear to be something else entirely. The bore log from the Illinois State Museum's 1966 geotechnical survey of the mound's interior, a survey conducted to assess the stability of the mound after slumping on its western face, records an anomaly at precisely the 23-foot depth that I want you to hold in your memory. The bore penetrated a compacted clay layer and encountered below it a zone the surveying geologist described as material of uncertain origin, exhibiting characteristics inconsistent with natural fill or collapsed wooden structure. The bore was stopped at that depth. The report notation states, obstruction, possibly structural. Drilling not continued per field instruction. Possibly structural. Per field instruction. Someone at the site told the operator to stop drilling. The report does not identify who gave that instruction or what authority they held over the survey. This is the part I keep returning to. Because 23 feet is the exact depth Edward Fales recorded in April of 1901. Not approximately 23 feet, the same depth, the same description. Compacted clay above, something structured and dry below, encountered by 2 entirely independent bore operations conducted 65 years apart. And in both cases the record closes at the same moment. One file is stamped closed in pencil. One bore is stopped per unnamed instruction. And between those 2 closures, there is a document in the Smithsonian Institution archives. In the administrative records of the Bureau of American Ethnology, there is an internal memorandum dated November 3, 1901, from William Henry Holmes, at that time chief of the Bay and one of the most consequential figures in the history of American archaeology, to Smithsonian Secretary Samuel Langley. Holmes's language in this memo is the language of a man who has already made a decision and is recording it formally, not deliberating. He described the situation at Cahokia as requiring permanent closure, and directed that no survey party is to be authorized access to the subsurface features of the primary mound pending further consideration by this office. Read that phrase again, the subsurface features, plural, definite, as if Holmes already knew what was there, had already characterized it, had already decided it would not be opened further. The memo also authorized a disbursement of $340 for what it calls site remediation at Monk's Mound, dated September 1901, several months before the memo itself, meaning the physical sealing had already occurred before Holmes committed the decision to paper. $340 in 1901 is equivalent to roughly $12,000 today. That is a sufficient sum to compact fill an access shaft, pour a clay plug, and pay the men who did the work to keep the matter to themselves. Further consideration by Holmes's office was never recorded. The memo is stamped filed, not for publication. And then there is the survey conducted in 1987. The University of Illinois Archaeological Survey conducted ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry passes across Monk's Mound in 1987, part of a larger assessment of the mound's structural integrity following slumping events on its western terrace. The results were compiled in a technical report published in 1988 and deposited with the Illinois State Archaeological Survey in Champaign, where they remain available to researchers who know to ask for them. Ground-penetrating radar does not identify what a void contains. It identifies that a void exists, defines its approximate boundaries, and indicates whether the surrounding material is consistent or inconsistent with the substrate around it. What it found in 1987 was a rectangular void reading, approximately 40 feet by 60 feet in plan, located beneath the second terrace of the mound at a depth fully consistent with a 23-foot figure appearing in both Fales's 1901 bore notation and the 1966 geotechnical log. The survey team noted the anomaly in their published report. They described it as a subsurface feature of uncertain origin, warranting further investigation. Further investigation has not occurred. The 1988 report sits in the archive in Champaign. The 1966 bore log sits in the archive in Springfield. The 1901 drainage survey with Whitmore's marginal notation sits in the National Archives in Kansas City. The Holmes Memorandum sits in the Smithsonian. None of these documents cites any of the others. No published paper has placed them in the same room. And that is not an accident of scholarship. It is the natural consequence of a decision made in 1901 that the subsurface features of the primary mound would not be investigated further. Consider what a 40 by 60-foot rectangular chamber beneath a ceremonial mound would mean in the context of Mississippian construction. The people who built Cahokia routinely built wooden structures of comparable and larger dimensions on the mound's upper terraces. A great building identified in recent excavations as occupying most of the first terrace's surface was estimated at approximately 50 feet by 100 feet in plan. They understood rectangular wooden structures at that scale. They built them deliberately. They oriented them with precision. And they buried them. Stage after stage of mound construction preserved the footprints of earlier buildings by encasing them in fill, which is why the post-molds survive. The builders understood that what went below the fill would be preserved by the fill, which means that if a structured void exists at the 23-foot depth in Monk's Mound, a void that has remained dry and intact across 9 centuries of mound settlement, and whose existence was confirmed by 3 independent investigations that were each stopped before they could characterize it. That void was either built to be preserved there, or it was built there first and the mound was built around it afterward. Neither of those possibilities is casual. Both of them carry implications that William Henry Holmes, in November of 1901, decided required permanent closure. The question, then, is not what Edward Fales found. It is why it frightened the most powerful archaeological institution in the United States enough to produce a response that fast. In 1901, the answer has to do with a debate that had consumed American archaeology for most of the 19th century, the Mound Builders controversy. The long, ugly argument over whether the earthworks of the Mississippi Valley had been constructed by the ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples or by some vanished, superior, implicitly non-native race had been effectively settled by Holmes and his colleagues at the Bay. Their field investigations had correctly established that the mounds were built by the ancestors of living indigenous peoples. That conclusion was right, and it had required decades of institutional effort to defend against amateur theorists, popular writers, and politicians who preferred the lost race story because it conveniently rendered Native Americans irrelevant to the landscape they had shaped. To maintain that correct conclusion against its critics, it had become institutionally necessary to present the mound builders as sophisticated, but not too sophisticated. Remarkable, but within limits the accepted framework could accommodate. A sealed interior chamber of engineered proportions beneath the continent's largest earthwork, whatever it contained, was a complication the field was not ready to absorb in 1901 without reopening arguments Holmes's team had spent 30 years closing. Permanent closure was not just about the mound, it was about the narrative. This was not the only mound, and this was not the only sealed thing. At Poverty Point in Louisiana, the enormous earthwork complex built around 1700 BCE, predating Cahokia by 2 millennia. The Smithsonian-affiliated surveys of the 1870s and 1880s produced field photographs showing subsurface disturbance at the primary mound's base that is not mentioned in any corresponding published report. At the Spiro Mounds in Oklahoma, the excavations of 1933 through 1935 opened a central sealed chamber known as the Great Mortuary and found inside it a collection of ceremonial objects whose craftsmanship astonished every archaeologist who examined them. Engraved shell cups, embossed copper plates, carved wooden effigies of a quality that had no precedent in the published literature on Mississippian culture. The official correspondence from that excavation describes the chamber's contents as an anomaly not representative of general site character. That phrase does not belong in any serious archaeological report. It is doing institutional work, not scientific work. At Serpent Mound in Ohio, geophysical surveys conducted in the 1980s identified subsurface features beneath the effigy mound that remain unexcavated, are not discussed in the site's public interpretation materials, and appear only in technical reports filed with the Ohio Historical Society. The pattern is not subtle once you have seen it across enough sites. The mounds consistently contained more than the published record acknowledged, and the published record was written by people with institutional reasons to ensure that the more remained unexamined. Edward Fales drilled into Monk's Mound in April of 1901 and found something at 23 feet that his bore described as structured, dry, and built from worked timber and dressed stone. He filed a report. 3 weeks later, a federal archaeological party arrived at his work site. 6 weeks after that, the access shaft was sealed. 8 months after that, Fales was gone from every record in which he had existed. He was not a famous man. He has no biography. He was a civil engineer doing a drainage survey. And he wrote a notation in a field report column that was specific enough and significant enough that it brought a Bureau of American Ethnology response team to an Illinois floodplain within 21 days. That response time is a measurement. It tells you how seriously someone in Washington read what Fales had written, and how quickly they acted on it, and what their priorities were when they did. What cannot be recovered is the interpretive framework, not the chamber, whatever it is, but the tradition of understanding that would tell you what a chamber in that position, in that mound, was built to hold, and why. The Mississippian world that produced Cahokia did not simply end. Its peoples carried knowledge forward through the displacement and dispersal that followed, through the generations that became the Osage, the Quapaw, the Chickasaw, and others whose oral traditions describe Monk's Mound as a place of interior significance, a place where things were kept below the visible surface, a place understood by its builders in ways that the surface alone cannot convey. That knowledge was not lost. It was made irrelevant. The institutional decision in 1901 did not consult the people whose ancestors built the mound, because consulting them would have converted a managerial decision about narrative control into something else entirely. A conversation with a living tradition about a physical thing that tradition had never stopped describing. That conversation was not one the Bureau of American Ethnology was prepared to have in 1901. And by the time the field was prepared to have it, the access shaft had been sealed for decades, and the question of why had been quietly reclassified as a matter already settled. They sealed the lower level. They made the engineer disappear from the record. They filed the memo and stamped it not for publication. And then they waited for the questions to arrive too slowly, from too many different archives, too far apart, for anyone to connect them in a single sitting. If this stays with you, share it with someone who still believes the archaeological record of this continent is complete, because the people who wrote that record also decided what would be closed before the writing began.